So in this talk I want to explore the fact that China's Green Revolution experience has been held up as a success story, that the experience of this agricultural Asian tiger has been used intermittently over the past 40 years as a kind of shining counterexample to what's been going on in agricultural development on the African continent. And then how really since 2008 and the aftermath of the global food crisis, that this discourse has been resurgent, okay? That we're even seeing more prominent use of the Chinese example than we had before. And I'm going to deal with this in kind of three pieces, okay? So I want to critically look at this Chinese Green Revolution narrative. Then I want to look at how it's being deployed in the African context. And then I want to look at some specific agricultural development initiatives and how they're being supported or undermined by this particular initiative. Okay? So I want to be very clear that I am not a China specialist, I'm an Africanist. But I'm very intrigued by this influence of China in Africa, particularly in the realm of agriculture. So what is the nature of the Chinese Green Revolution narrative? And I think while we could go back further in history, and there have been recurrent famines, the most recent and most dramatic one was China's Great Famine of 1958 to 1961, which reportedly killed 36 million people, which is just astounding. Okay? China responded in a couple of different ways. Okay? First of all, it's determined to become food self-sufficient. And initially, it has a dual approach. Okay? One is a Green Revolution approach, patterned after what is happening or what is being spearheaded by Western countries in the 60s and 70s. But also initially it has an agroecological approach, this kind of biointensive approach. So there's this piece, how do we increase agricultural production? But then secondly, and this doesn't become aggressively enforced or put into place until the late 1970s, it's the one-child policy, so to rein in population growth. Okay? I think China's opening up to the world, and you know, this is often most clear in our minds with Nixon's visit to China in 1972. That opening up influenced the path that China eventually took in terms of agriculture. And one of the first types of exchanges that occurs after that Nixon visit is the exchange of Green Revolution technology with the West. And in particular, China ordered 13 of the largest, most modern American-designed nitrogen fertilizer plants. Okay? And more were subsequently purchased. And so then China becomes the world's largest producer of nitrogenous fertilizers, which are being used in combination with hybrid seeds to boost yields and production. And this biointensive path, which was being explored up until that point, is more or less left to the wayside. Okay, so this is a critical moment. The next critical moment is a series of changes which occur after Mao Zedong's death. So you have a reformist faction of the Communist Party which comes into power in 1979, and they begin to implement a series of changes in the agricultural sector. So agriculture is decollectivized, it's decentralized, and you have the introduction of what they call the household responsibility system. So you still have a quota that you need to fill and provide to the state, but then if you exceed that quota, the production is that of the households. They can do with it what they want. They can consume it, they can sell it. Okay? And people are also granted individual tenure rights. It's not private tenure like we're used to in the West, but it's usufruct rights. Households have secure use rights to that land. So instead of collectivized production, it's individual household production. And also there's a policy of increasing kind of free market approach to pricing so that producer prices rise for what people are producing. Okay, so this set of reforms, okay, in combination with the use of new Green Revolution technology, is argued is what led to an astronomical rise in agricultural production in the Chinese continent. So by 1984, food rationing is lifted. Okay, China has a per capita food supply by the 80s that is close to what Japan has, so a very kind of comfortable mean situation. And this is just some information. This is provided by USDA. Thank you very much. I'm not going to point too much here, but you see through the 70s, 80s, and 90s increasing production both of grains and of oil seeds, okay, which again are linked back to this series of reforms. Okay, so this particular approach, okay, and this success in the agricultural sector is argued by other scholars as well, Gulati and Fan, for example, that this success in the agricultural sector leads to subsequent success in terms of industrialization. Okay? So it's called the firing from the bottom strategy. So you have to develop your agricultural sector before you can become successful at industrialization. This, if I look at this particular table, reminds me a lot of Rostow's modernization theory, his stages of economic growth, that you go from subsistence to commercial agriculture, and that surplus allows you to invest in industrialization. But people are also arguing that developing agriculture is really key for reducing poverty. And some work suggest that the growth in agriculture contributed to poverty reduction 4 times as much as the subsequent increase in manufacturing did. So because of this success, okay, the Chinese example is often used to promote the Green Revolution approach. And this is not new, okay? So Norman Borlaug, the grandfather of the Green Revolution, has, for many years prior to his death, was using China as this great success story. So this is not something new. So he writes, since 1980, China has been the greatest success story. Home to 1/5 of the world's people, China today is the world's biggest food producer. With each successive year, its cereal crop yields approach that of the United States. That's one story of what happened in China. And what was fascinating for me is to start to dig into the literature about an alternate story of what happened in China. And one of the most interesting and compelling scholars that I've interacted with and read his material is Joshua Muldavin, who's a geographer at Sarah Lawrence. He's a student of Michael Watts, if some of you know his work. But he has a very interesting background because his parents were Russian Bolsheviks who immigrated to China and were spent a good part of their lives on communes in China. And Joshua, because of this family connection, has also spent a lot of time on communes. So he has this kind of deep kind of family connection to China, and I think he's one of the foremost scholars on kind of agrarian change in the Chinese context. So he has a different story of what happened. Okay. And he argues that this surge in production that we saw in China from the late 1970s and in the 80s was not necessarily related to these sets of reforms. Okay? He argues that there were a set of assets that were built up during the collectivization period, okay? investments in the land, as well as the construction of fertilizer plants, okay? And then at the moment of these reforms, not only do those fertilizer plants come on stream, in addition to this imported American technology, but also these collective assets, in a sense, are pillaged during the free market period. And that, for him, is what leads to this surge in production. Okay? And then if you look more recently at the production data, okay, so production is increasing until the 90s, but from the late 90s moving forward, it has more or less plateaued. Okay, there is some fluctuation, but it has more or less plateaued. So Muldavin argues, and this is backed up by field work and soil analysis, he argues that this plateauing is related to declining yields, which are related to many years of overuse of chemical fertilizers. And some of you may be soil scientists, but if you heavily use chemical fertilizers without organic inputs, it leads to a problem known as soil acidification, which depresses your yields. Okay? So he's arguing that it's these declines which are leading to the plateauing of agricultural production in China, as well as it's related to the loss of land due to urbanizations. So this is a problem for China, okay? Its production has plateaued, yet consumption continues to increase. And the increases in consumption are not so much related to population growth, but to urbanization. So as China is urbanizing, diets are changing, and that's putting more pressure on the agricultural sector. So how is this narrative of what happened in the Chinese experience being deployed in the African context? Okay. And what I find very, very interesting is that it's now being more aggressively applied post-2008, post-global food crisis. So it's resurgent, okay, even though this had been done before. Okay. So this is a quote from a report published by IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute, in 2010. And, quote, "The model of agriculture applied by the People's Republic of China during the last 30 years is an example that the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa should follow in their quest for development and growth to eradicate poverty." Okay? So Western institutions, Western think tanks are using this Chinese example in arguing that sub-Saharan Africa should be doing what China did, okay? Both to increase agricultural production, and that this is also the secret to economic growth, that you have to focus on agriculture before you can focus on industry, okay? Now, the Chinese as well, okay, so it's not just the West that are using the example, but the Chinese as well are using their own example, okay, and encouraging those in sub-Saharan Africa to follow their model. So this is a quote from the governor of the Chinese Development Bank from 2008. This was at a meeting of African finance ministers in Mauritania. China's Development Bank is anxious to work in the area of agriculture given the current scenario of food shortage and food price hikes. I believe African countries should put agricultural development at the top of their priority. Okay, so this is being supported. One of the foremost Africanist scholars in the Chinese academy is a guy named Professor Li Anshan, who works on agriculture, and he's head of the African Studies Unit at Beijing University. So here he's saying Africans desperately need to modernize their agriculture, both to ensure their food security and to earn hard currency by supporting it. China needs to deal with its growing food demand, and Africa seems to offer the solution. So here there's an additional nuance, okay? Not only should Africa focus on increasing its agricultural production, but there's a synergy here with Chinese needs, okay? That China needs to find new sources for food given its own plateauing of agricultural production, and Africa is a logical place to focus one's efforts. Important moment, the 2008 global food crisis. So, we went through a period of low food prices in the 80s and 90s, but food prices begin to gradually increase from 2000, okay? 2007 to 2008, average food prices increased by about 50%. For some commodities like rice, they increased 100%, okay? So this, is of concern to the Chinese, okay? How are they going to access food at a reasonable price? It's, like I said, of concern to the Americans because of security concerns. Food prices did go back down after 2008, but they've come back up in 2011, okay? But it's a different set of commodities than we saw in 2008. And this is just a longer-term view of food prices adjusted for inflation. So you have your nominal food prices, but the real food prices, if you adjust for inflation, you will notice that this is not the highest global food prices have ever been. If we go back to an earlier period in the 70s and the 60s, they got as high then as they are now. Okay? But high food prices are a particular problem for the urban poor. Okay? This is a big generalization, but typically the urban poor, in comparison to their rural counterparts, don't produce as much of their own food. They're more dependent on the market, and a large proportion of their incomes are spent on food. So, one of the key indicators for food insecurity in the urban context is the price of food. So, when global food prices went up, this spawned a lot of social unrest around the world. Much, but not all of it in the global south. And there's a particular concentration in West African coastal cities, which by the time this happens are heavily dependent on imported rice, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly from Asian producers. So rice went up 100% in this time. So it leads to so-called food riots. Okay? I am guilty of deploying this term food riots, but I have increasingly become uneasy with the notion of a food riot because I think it implies that there's spontaneous violence, okay? That we kind of have this image of animals fighting over scraps of food in a period of scarcity, and I don't really think that's an accurate description of what was going on. I think in a lot of these coastal West African cities, demonstrators are unhappy with their governments. They're trying to draw their government's attention to the vulnerability of the urban poor. They're dissatisfied with a set of government policies which led to this particular movement. And I think that's really different than the kind of food riot image that we often have in our country. So now I'm going to focus specifically on Mali. And I'll be frank, it's because I know this place well. It's a place I've been in and out of for the past 25 years, which allows me to kind of look more in depth at what happened there. Okay? So, and how this Chinese Green Revolution narrative influenced the response. Okay? So, interestingly, Bamako, Mali, the capital city, did not experience food riots. Okay? But the Malian government was extremely nervous in 2007, 2008. Okay? So Mali did ban exports of grains. So you did have an issue where you had a lot of traders from coastal countries who are coming in and they're trying to buy up grain in Mali. Okay? And the government was very concerned about that. I don't think it really stopped it. Okay? People were paying bribes at the borders to get the grain out. But you could argue that that is a de facto export tariff. Okay, so it probably did slow down the exodus of grain. Okay? The other thing that they did is they completely removed import tariffs. So import tariffs on food had been reduced during the structural adjustment years. There were small tariffs left, and then those were completely removed. Okay? In addition to this, there were other ways, longer-term strategies for responding, and I want to talk about two of these. Okay? And the first of these, the Chinese are not directly involved, okay, in the NERICA rice initiative, but I think they're example inspired this, and it's actually the Americans that are more heavily involved in this first response. Okay? So in the southern part of the country, which historically is the breadbasket of West Africa, you are growing sorghum, millet, maize, groundnuts, okay? And it's a food surplus area, and the big cash crop is cotton. Okay? And the Prime Minister of Mali in 2008, because of this concern about global food prices, launches a massive initiative to plant NERICA rice in the southern part of the country. Okay? So this is just an image of typical landscape in southern Mali. Okay? You have seasonally flooded areas that are in the lower lying areas where traditionally women, and rice was a women's crop, women would grow rice. Okay? But in the gentle slopes, the upland areas, we would grow sorghum, millet, maize, and cotton, and peanuts. Okay? This is a topo sequence. It's a profile of the landscape. I apologize for the indigenous soil types, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of how rice was grown in the lower areas, and you have these other crops which are grown on the slopes. Okay? Not much surplus rice is grown in southern Mali. Women grow it, and it's a kind of a special crop for weddings, for celebrations. Okay, the major food crop in these areas, like I said, are these other coarse grains. What the Prime Minister wanted to do was convert a lot of these sorghum and millet fields to rice production, upland, dryland rice production. So he launches this huge initiative in the spring of 2008, February, March, April, this period. Everybody, according to the interviews I did in the agricultural ministry, are pointing out that this is highly problematic. Okay, they don't have the NERICA rice seeds, they don't have the inputs, okay, the fertilizers and the pesticides that you need to do this, but the Prime Minister, who's angling to be the next president of Mali, and we're having an election in this spring of 2012, is really staking his political fortunes on this initiative. Okay? So the extension folks go out, they disseminate seeds, they disseminate inputs, and they work with men. Okay? So they want men to grow rice, and rice is a female crop in this part of Mali. Okay? They end this campaign, okay, and it's declared an amazing success, okay? And from all I can tell from the interviews I did, so no government people in the government on record would say that it was a failure, but oftentimes you'd do an interview, you'd walk outside, and then you'd get a second story of what happened. And so off the record, as well as based on observations that I did in the rural areas, it was a massive failure. Okay? So how can you report a great success when it was a massive failure? Well, two things happened. They did have a bumper crop up in this rice growing area up here, the traditional export-oriented rice growing area. So you had a big crop, and part of that's attributed to the south. The other thing that happened is when the extension staff went out, they picked the best farmer in each village who had the highest yields, and then they extrapolated those yield results to everybody that grew rice. So as one of my ag economist friends has told me, if indeed this was the success they claimed it to be, then there are some secret grain elevators out there somewhere that hold all this rice that was supposedly produced. But the thing to keep in mind is that this was important internally politically. The Prime Minister needed this to be a success to ensure that he would be a viable candidate in the presidential election. But also externally, okay, NERICA rice in agronomy circles is the next greatest thing. It's the silver bullet that is going to save West Africa from the food crisis. So I think there was a lot of interest externally in this being a success. Okay? And the Extension Service and USAID and some other prominent actors were quite involved. The second example that I want to focus on a bit. Okay, and this is in this major rice-producing area called the Office du Niger, and it has a very interesting history. So the French were very keen, okay, in the 1920s to replicate what had happened with cotton production in Egypt. Okay, so they wanted to have irrigated cotton production. So they built a dam just downstream from Segu in a town called Macalester, and they diverted water out of the Niger River into a series of perimeters. Okay, they initially focused on cotton. It was a massive failure, basically because it was economically unsustainable. The costs of producing cotton were so high that it could not be sustained. So they very quickly switch over to rice. Okay. This particular scheme was built at great human cost. Okay. There weren't enough local people to construct the dam and the rice perimeters, so they brought in a lot of labor from Burkina Faso, who subsequently stayed. Okay. But there was, it was forced labor, there was pretty significant loss of life. And from an ecological standpoint, you were taking about 70% of the flow out of the river, which creates huge problems downstream for an inland delta area known as the Inland Niger River Delta. So, you know, you gain this production within this irrigation scheme, but then you lost production downstream, which was the traditional rice-producing area. Okay. So, in 2008, the Malian government signs a deal with the Libyan government, a 50-year lease of 100,000 hectares within this Office du Niger. Okay. So this is the area we're talking about. This is that inland delta that I talked about. This is where the dam is, where you're diverting water up into these areas. This is a blow-up of this. And this is the project we're talking about. So it was a Libyan sovereign wealth fund. Okay. We don't know how much money was exchanged, but it's a 50-year lease for that land. These are two other projects north of there, but these are more kind of traditional development projects, focused on increasing rice production, but more for domestic consumption. This project is about producing rice for export. Okay, so it's a Libyan sovereign wealth fund, but the implementers of the project are two Chinese firms. Okay, so like I had mentioned previously, China is very active in Mali on a lot of construction projects. They have a tea production project, they have a sugar production project, but along with this have come all these Chinese private sector operators, and they then become the implementers for other types of development projects. Okay. So there's a Chinese firm that's building the infrastructure, and then there's a Chinese firm that's bringing in the improved seeds and training people how to produce rice using this particular package, this Green Revolution approach to improve food production. Okay. In order to kind of revitalize and increase production in this area, roads were built, and one of the largest canals was built in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's about 30 meters wide, it's 40 kilometers long, so it's an extension, another canal off of this Office du Niger project. In the process of building the canal, there are a couple of issues that come up. Okay? One is that there were communities in the way, so they needed to be moved. But also, this is an area of intensive animal husbandry. So when you build this canal, you interrupt the pathways that transhumant pastoralists normally move. And then there's the big issue of diverting water. So remember, we're already diverting 70% of the Niger River's water, and now we're going to divert even more. And this has serious consequences. This is a blow-up of this area downstream, the inland Niger Delta. So this traditionally is where rice was produced in Mali, There's a lot of good scholarship that suggests this is where African rice was initially domesticated. There are two major kinds of rice in the world, African and Asian rice. Okay? So this has a long history of rice production, and it's also a site of incredible agrobiodiversity in terms of different types of rice varieties. They also practice recessional agriculture. So, the floods come in around June, the water level starts to go up, it starts receding in December, and as that water recedes, you can plant on the residual moisture as the river recedes. Okay? Also, as the river recedes, there's a plant known as burgu, which is prime fodder for animals. So in the dry season, there's a pastoralists come into this area, they graze their cattle, and then they'll leave this area when the rains return. So this whole set of kind of fishing and agriculture and pastoral livelihoods is being threatened by increasing diversion of water upstream from this site. Does the Chinese Green Revolution narrative provide useful policy suggestions for African agricultural development? Is this a model that African countries should follow? My concern here is that we're getting a sanitized version of the history of what happened in the Chinese context. And it reminds me so much of the way structural adjustment was sold in the African context. So if you've studied structural adjustment, you may know that what the World Bank did is it pointed to the examples of the NICs, the newly industrialized countries in East Asia. And it said this spectacular rise in development was due to a certain set of free market policies. And it kind of varnished over the fact that there was a heavy state involvement in actually making that happen. Okay? So my concern is that in a sense we're seeing a repeat of this, that we're getting a distorted and simplified version of what happened in China. And now this is being used to push a particular agenda in the African context. Okay? My concern is that this approach is benefiting outsiders more than it is Africans. I think it's beneficial to the Chinese because it's pushing for an export-oriented form of agriculture, and increasingly that's something that China needs. Okay? As it becomes more industrialized, it will no longer be self-sufficient in food production. So it needs other export-oriented food producers. In a similar way, I think this is beneficial to the United States because we have an agro-industrial complex, agrochemical firms that produce inputs that will be used by these African producers. So from a business perspective, it's useful to us as well. So in contrast to that, I look at China perhaps as a lesson what not to do. Okay? It went down a particular road. Okay? It worked for a time. We've seen that production has now plateaued. Okay? And maybe, another way of looking at this African example is to, look more carefully at that experience and see if it's really appropriate for sub-Saharan Africa, and perhaps re-explore that biointensive path that the Chinese were initially on, but then subsequently abandoned when it adopted the Green Revolution approach. Thank you. My limited understanding is that the Chinese were actively exploring this biointensive approach at one point in time. And then it was abandoned. But it's an approach that is very focused on plant interactions. So, if you mix legumes and grains, they can facilitate the growth of one another through fixing things like nitrogen. Or if you use polycultures, it reduces insect problems, so then you don't have to use as many pesticides. It's an approach which probably became most evolved in Cuba because they were forced to deal with that problem because of, they were no longer a patron of the Soviet Union and the US had an embargo on them, so we saw a lot of progress on that particular front. So there's In the scientific literature, there's this argument from a certain quarter that you can never be as productive following this agroecological route. There's another group of scholars who are arguing that it could be close to almost as productive and in many ways more efficient because you don't have to input all this energy to get this kind of output.
So what do you propose for doing that?
I think you need government support and scientific establishment that's gonna support that kind of approach. I mean, working very closly with local people, trying to build on indigenous systems and improve them. But we don't, the extension service in every African country I've seen, and I've worked closely in 6 African countries, tend to be heavily in favor of a green revolution approach. And this is not a new thing. I mean, this dates back to the 1960s and 70s when most African countries had a policy of food self-sufficiency. That gets abandoned after structural adjustment, and now we're seeing the return of that. The Green Revolution was not only problematic in China from my perspective, but it was problematic in other areas of the world it was implemented. So, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, it does lead to increasing yields, this is true, but at what ecological and social cost? So, in many instances, it was the wealthier households that could afford these technologies. It increases stratification in rural societies. The wealthier farmers get wealthier. They leave the poor farmers behind. In many instances, the poorest farmers start working for the wealthier farmers or lose their land entirely. And then from an ecological perspective, there was a huge problem with pesticide resistance. Pest communities develop resistance to chemicals, and you have to use increasingly high doses to get the same result. So I'm concerned that we didn't learn all the lessons from this first green revolution of the 60s and 70s, and we're potentially replicating those with this new green revolution. And the argument is that the first green revolution didn't really touch the African continent. There are some notable exceptions to that, like Zimbabwe, where maize yields increased dramatically. But what's really interesting about the Zimbabwe case, so this is held up, this is the Green Revolution success story in the African continent. Though that increasing productivity was largely amongst large-scale white farmers, okay? And that's kind of wallpapered over. There are lots of problems with the first Green Revolution, and I wish we would take on board all of those issues before we start pushing it again. I guess I favor kind of a nuanced hybrid approach. How can you use local insights and combine them with outside expertise to come up with a hybrid, better solution? And I think the problem is that agricultural extension in most African countries, as well as in the United States, okay, it was different in the progressive era, but in the recent times has been about disseminating technologies. So, someone in a lab decides that this is the problem, comes up with the solution, and then teaches people how to do it, okay? So, for example, in southern Mali, the big cash crop is cotton. So you have an agricultural extension service which goes out, has very pejorative opinions of peasants, tells them that they're stupid and ignorant, and they say that, okay? And argue that you need to use this kind of modern approach to growing cotton, and your intercropping practices, your local food crops are backward and primitive and have low yields. So it's all about introducing this new approach. And I wish agricultural extension could often work in reverse. So, you know, local people have a set of strategies. Certainly they encounter problems and bottlenecks. If they could communicate those to the agricultural service and the research centers in their country, and then they work on those problems and come back. So it's this dialogue to solve these problems. But it's kind of, we need to reverse engineer that process, and that it doesn't happen that way.